All right, what's up, guys, and welcome to part two of my Queen and Pawn Endgame here at Late Night Chess. I'm Nick, and I'm going to walk you through in this video some stalemate tricks for the side that has a pawn in Queen and Pawn Endgames, if that pawn is on the C or F file. So you might be wondering, in this diagram, the pawn's not on the C or F file, so why we're looking at a pawn on the D file, especially when in the previous video we already solved this. But I just wanted to go through again and reiterate how white wins this position. And then we're going to look at a position where every piece on this board is one square to the left. And then somehow magically black is able to stalemate in that position. So if you haven't seen the first video, part one, I've got it linked below this video. Check it out. We walk through how to win these types of positions. But if you remember, so white's going to play queen c4. The king comes over. The queen gets a little bit closer to the pawn. And when the king comes back to defend the pawn, you check. And as the king gets in front of the pawn, you move your king in. And you repeat this process, and white will win. So we know from the last video that this position is a win for white. White just needs to get the black king in front of the pawn and then bring his own white king in, and this will be a clear win. What's interesting, though, is when we shift every single piece over to the left one, so in this position, notice if you go back to the old position, everything's just shifted over one square. You'd think the exact same idea should hold. There should be no difference and white should still win. But black actually has a stalemating trick in this position. So a rule of thumb in queen and pawn endgames, if you are the side with the pawn and you have a pawn either on the C or the F file, there's a pretty good chance you're going to be able to stalemate. So let's walk through how black can stalemate this position. And it's not like there's some trick here that white has to play inaccurately. Even with perfect play, this position is indeed a draw. So let's see why. So white would play queen b4, just like in the last position. So let's say white tried to do the same idea, right? Get the king to be in front of the pawn and then bring their king in. That's really the only way white could try and win this game. So queen b4, king a2, and then the same idea, right? Queen c3 hitting the pawns. The black king has to come back and defend. And now queen b3, and here's the trick. If every single piece were over to the right one, like we saw in the last position, black would have to come here in front of the pawn. And then after black comes in front of the pawn, white can bring his king in. But interestingly enough, black has this really cool move, king a1, with the idea that the queen cannot capture this pawn, or else it's stalemate. So if queen takes c2, stalemate. The king has nowhere he can go, right? He can't come to any of these squares because the queen is blocking all of them off. So unlike in the previous position where the pawn was on the d file, the king would have to come in front of the pawn. In this case, the king can actually shuffle over to the right, or to the left in this case, and let white take the pawn, and it's a stalemate. And really, there's no way for white to have time to bring the king closer. If the queen tries to play, check a4, queen a4 check, and the king comes right in front of the pawn, and white has no time to bring the king forward because this pawn is going to promote. So white has to go back and check the king again, and then you just repeat this position. And there's really no progress that can be made. So a good rule of thumb, and there are some exceptions, and we'll actually show one of those exceptions in a future video, probably the fourth video of this series, where we get into some puzzles. Not all the time, but most of the time, when the side with the pawn has a pawn on the C or the F file, you can play for these stalemate tricks. So keep that in mind when you're when you seem to be the losing side of these positions with the pawn, and you might be able to kind of force white to stalemate you. What I will say, and we'll get into this in a puzzle in the future, is that if the king is close enough, like if the king were here, or I think even if the king were on one of these squares, it's not necessarily a stalemate. There's ideas of actually getting black to promote the queen, but it doesn't matter, and white will still be able to checkmate. So we'll get into one of those puzzles in a future video, but for the most part, if you encounter a situation in a queen and pawn endgame where you have the pawn, and the pawn is on the C or the F file, you'll be able to play for these types of Stalemate Trick. So, okay, cool. Well, tune in for the next video, which is going to be, so we've covered so far pawns on all of the files, except for the rook pawn file. So we've learned if the pawn is on the D or the E or the G or the B file, then the person with the queen is going to win. If the pawn's on the C or the F file, most of the time it's going to be a draw. And then we're going to get into the next video what happens if you're playing against a rook pawn. And there's similar stalemating themes that the side with the queen has to look out for, and that the side with the pawn is really going to be trying to play for to get a stalemate. So we'll get into that in the next video. So until then, thanks for tuning in, and talk to everybody soon. Take care.